This episode contains discussions of racism, starvation, spousal abuse, and death, in some cases involving children. If this isn't something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. When most people hear the Oregon Trail, they think of either the 1985 computer game created by the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium or a stereotypical mid-1800s American pioneer family in a covered wagon bravely crossing a sea of undulating grasses and grand mountains to reach a new and better land to settle in. On the other hand, when most people think of the Donner Party, all they remember are that they were a family that was somehow lost or stuck in the woods and ended up eating each other. Most people don't know that the Donner Party traveled the Oregon Trail, but instead of aiming for Oregon, their goal was California. While there was an established wagon trail to California, which branched off from the Oregon Trail, the Donner Party, which was made up of many families other than just the Donners, decided to take a shortcut, one that had been advertised as a massive time saver. Unfortunately, that shortcut hadn't been tested, leading to trouble on an already difficult journey. While cannibalism does feature in the true story of the Donner Party, it was only the most miserable piece of their long journey west, a journey fraught with hardship, culminating in a forced stay over the winter in the Sierra Mountains without food or help. In this first part of this episode, we'll discuss why the Donners and their companions were traveling west, why they decided to take a shortcut, and just how disastrous that shortcut turned out to be. In part 2, we'll discuss their terrible winter in the Sierras and their eventual rescue. But for now, let's begin at the beginning, in April of 1846. The United States was still quite a new political body, inhabiting most of the East Coast all the way to Independence, Missouri. West of Missouri was the so-called unorganized territory, full of vast areas of prairie that were home to many indigenous tribes, but which were considered empty by most white Americans. Further west of the unorganized territory, starting near the western border of Colorado and stretching to the Pacific Ocean, lay the lands still belonging to Mexico, including the modern states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. America was changing from a new and struggling nation into an international political power. The president at the time, James K. Polk, had his heart set on national expansion, both westward and southward. Texas was invaded and then annexed by the United States in 1845 at the cost of 14,000 lives. Polk now had his eyes turned on the unconquered Mexican territories on the west coast. Polk believed that God meant for America to stretch from sea to shining sea, and was ready to begin the colonization, as was the God-given right of the American people. This mode of thought was called manifest destiny, and Polk was not the only one who subscribed to it. In fact, this was the going rhetoric at the time, and it was preached in churches as well as in the government in order to justify westward expansion and the invasion of Mexico. The 1840s was a time of virtually unchallenged belief in white supremacy. Indigenous tribes, at the time referred to as Indians, were either ignored completely or thought of as savage, uncivilized people that would benefit from the benevolent spread of civilization and Christianity brought to them through white colonization. This was similar to the attitude of the many slave owners in the southern states toward black enslaved peoples. While not every American agreed with this ideology, this type of racism and privileged thinking was in the majority and would eventually result in massacres, millions of deaths by disease, and the confinement of many indigenous tribes to reservations. But this is a subject for another episode. This rhetoric of the God-given right to expand and conquer was born of the American desire for space and resources. Despite bountiful harvests from Illinois to the East Coast, the people of America were restless. More and more immigrants were arriving from Ireland, Germany, and England, making the cities of the East Coast feel crowded. Those who could afford it moved into the countryside, but soon that began to feel crowded as well, and crowds were becoming something to avoid. The American people had just lived through a terrible epidemic of cholera, which hit hardest in the crowded cities with little sanitation. The country was also stuck in a lingering depression from the financial crisis of 1837. With the political and ideological rhetoric of the Americans' right to colonize the rest of the country, many people sought adventure and a new life in the West, mostly on the coast in Oregon and California. Those that traveled west did so by covered wagon and were referred to as emigrants, as they were leaving the known United States for a new and mostly unknown country. In 1846, a band of emigrants that would later be referred to as the Donner Party departed Springfield, Illinois for Alta, California, which at the time was a Mexican province. The group consisted of brothers Jacob and George Donner and their families, and James Reed and his family. Both the Donners and James Reed had family who had already moved west, and they had heard it was a great place to start fresh and earn a profit quickly. James Reed, who was 46, saw California as his last chance to succeed. He had debts from his mill business going under during the Depression, and his wife, Margaret, age 32, was constantly plagued by migraines. He hoped that in California he could start a profitable business, and the sunny weather might help Margaret. Together they had 4 children: Martha, who was also called Patty, age 8, James Jr., age 5, Thomas, age 3, and Margaret's daughter from a previous marriage, Virginia, who was 12. Before leaving, Reed sold all his property and businesses to pay off his debts so that he could begin with a clean slate. He even got a letter of recommendation from the governor of Illinois to help him get established once he reached California. Reed was a Freemason and a veteran of the Black Hawk War, where he had served with Abraham Lincoln in an 1832 campaign against an indigenous tribe who were deeply offended when their burial ground was tilled up by white settlers. While he didn't see much combat, Reed made many friends among the other troops. Because of these associations, Reed had a network of Masonic brothers and other veterans which would aid him along his way to California. Most of this aid would come before leaving the United States and once he got to California, but they were slightly useful throughout the journey. Jacob and George Donner were farmers. By moving west, they hoped to acquire land and have a grand adventure. Both men had grown up moving from place to place and were ready to try somewhere wholly new. George Donner, the older brother at age 60, was married to Tamsin, 44, an intelligent and educated teacher who was also a rising botanist. On the journey, she hoped to learn about the plants in the unorganized territory and perhaps start a school for girls once they reached California. George and Tamsin had 5 children. Together they had Francis, age 6, George Jr., age 4, and Eliza, age 3. From George's previous wife, they also had Elitha Kumi, age 14, and Liana, age 12. Jacob Donner, who was 56, was married to Betsy, who was 45. They had a total of 7 children, with 5 being from their marriage: George, who was 9, Mary, 7, Isaac, 5, Samuel, 4, and Louis, 3, and 2 others from Betsy's previous marriage: Solomon Hook, aged 14, and William Hook, aged 13. The Donners also had a letter of introduction from their preacher that they hoped would help them find a place in a good community once they reached California. All 3 families also hired men to drive the oxen and look after the other animals that they were bringing with them. Most who signed on were young single men looking for adventure and new prospects. The Donners hired Noah James, 16, a cousin of Abraham Lincoln's law partner, Samuel Shoemaker, who was 25, from Ohio, John Denton, 28, who was a gunsmith from Sheffield, England, and Hiram Owens Miller, 29, a blacksmith originally from Kentucky. The Reeds hired half-brother and sister Eliza Williams, a 31-year-old deaf cook, and Bayless Williams, a 25-year-old albino gentleman who would serve as the night watchman, both of whom had worked at Reed's old mill. Milford Elliott, 18, who had also worked for Reed, Walter Heron, 27, who was from Virginia, and James Smith, age 25. The emigrants also read up on what they might face on their journey. One of the newer books on the trails, and one that they heavily subscribed to, was The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California by Lansford W. Hastings. In it, Hastings, who was a young real estate promoter hoping to draw people out to the west, discussed supplies, routes, and the perils they might face. He also made brief mention of a new time-saving route through the Wasatch Mountains, moving south of the Great Salt Lake and across the Great Salt Desert. This new route became known as the Hastings Cut-Off, and as we'll discuss later, it turned out to be disastrous for the Donner Party. This is because the book was written without actually knowing anything about the area. Hastings was a promoter, paid to convince people to go west and stop at Fort Bridger in what is now Uri, Wyoming, which lay along his new cut-off route, and to Sutter's Fort in what is now Sacramento, California. But the Donner-Reed party didn't know this. These families were well prepared for their journey. They brought non-perishable foodstuffs, extra cattle for milk, butter, and meat, guns for hunting and defense, things to trade with the indigenous peoples for their help in navigating rivers and canyons, and horses to ride if the weight of the wagons burdened the teams of oxen that pulled them. Because Margaret Reed's bedridden 70-year-old mother, Sarah Keyes, would be coming with them, the Reeds built a large wagon especially for her, which contained a feather bed and an iron cook stove. It also had a second story for the children to sleep in. The locals nicknamed it the Pioneer Palace, but the Reeds just called it the family wagon. Along the journey, the Donner-Reed party would join other caravans, welcome new members, split up, and reunite again, as many caravans were traveling the same route. The members of these caravans were fluid, but people always traveled in groups, both for protection as well as resource sharing, and to maintain a sense of community. These splits and joins usually occurred due to the speed of travel, the destination, and also quality of leadership. The leaders of each large caravan were elected, as democracy was a highly valued element of civility, and therefore maintained even on the road west. The Donner-Reed party left Springfield, Illinois on April 14, 1846, in 9 covered wagons, each pulled by 3 oxen, except the family wagon, which required 4. It took about 26 days to reach Independence, Missouri. Along the way, they saw the brand-new steam technology on the ferries they rode across the Mississippi. They rested outside small towns and villages in their wagons and tents. They crossed the Missouri River at Lexington, the largest city west of St. Louis. Once they reached Independence, Missouri, the gateway to the new frontier, on May 10th, they paused for a few days to resupply. The city was like no other they had ever seen. It was cosmopolitan, busy, and full of other emigrants ready to leave for the West. Most groups usually didn't leave until mid-May, so that grass was guaranteed for their oxen along the way. The Donner-Reed party left Independence on May 12th, following the well-worn ruts of thousands of other wagon wheels. The going was slow due to rain and mud. They crossed several rivers thanks to the skill of their hired men, called teamsters. On May 15th, they stopped at Little Santa Fe, a small hamlet. This was their last stop within the United States. The rest of the journey would be through wild country, which was then known as Indian Territory, thanks to the fact that many tribal peoples had been pushed into this area and told that white Americans wouldn't settle there. The land was flat and mostly treeless. While the settlers feared encounters with the indigenous peoples, the ones they did have were peaceful. On May 19th, the Donner-Reed party met up with another large caravan at the Kansas River and asked to join them. They were headed by William Henry Russell, also known as Owl Russell, who was a lawyer and politician. They were welcomed in and continued their journey. Travel, for the most part, was easygoing, if not a little slow, due to the massive size of the caravan. They were also delayed by storms and mud, mosquitoes, and minor outbreaks of fever due to constant exposure to the damp weather. The Russell caravan was joined by other wagons. Some wagons departed in smaller groups in order to travel faster, and Tamsin and several others took breaks to gather samples of the local fauna. A hired man named Charles Tyler Stanton became close with the Donner and Reed families. The Russell caravan became further delayed by high river waters, which didn't allow for safe crossing of the Blue River, and the death of Sarah Keyes, Margaret Reed's mother, which was granted a day of mourning. Unrest among the company began to stir due to the slow speed of the caravan, and eventually all those headed for Oregon left. After this, unrest still lingered, and several times small brawls broke out. The further west they went, the more they had to pay attention to where fresh water might be found, where there was grass for the oxen, and when they could get fresh meat through hunting. Wood was also scarce, so buffalo droppings, called chips, were used instead because they burned hot and were easily gathered. The increasing heat made many people see mirages of water. At one point, a young boy's leg was crushed beneath a wagon wheel. He died after an attempt was made to amputate it. On June 18th, Owl Russell resigned as leader of the caravan, stating ill health, but there had been attempts to oust him before this. A man named Boggs was voted in as the new leader. At Fort Laramie, George and Tamsin Donner took on a passenger, a young man named Antonio. When the caravan reached Fort Bernard on June 26th, James Reed heard that Lansford Hastings himself would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide emigrants down his new trail. Reed also ran into a man he had served with in the Black Hawk War, James Clyman. When Clyman heard the Reeds and Donners planned to take the Hastings Cut-Off to make up for lost time, he strongly advised against it, calling Hastings a fraud. The Boggs caravan took heed of Clyman's advice and decided to avoid the cut-off, but Reed and the Donners were set on taking it. They felt it would get them to California faster. Factions began to form in the large caravan along ethnic and religious lines as well. The biggest division came when the parties reached Independence Rock on July 11th. Many families left for Oregon immediately, having changed their minds about California. Only 18 wagons were left in the caravan. On July 19th, while the oxen were showing signs of sickness from drinking the alkaline water in the area, the caravan split again at Little Sandy River, with some headed down the proven trail to Fort Hall and the rest keen to attempt the Hastings Cut-Off and heading to Fort Bridger. Those who decided to accompany the Reeds and Donners included the Murphy Foster Pike caravan with their 4 wagons, Patrick and Margaret Breen, an Irish family with their 7 children, 3 wagons, and their neighbor and driver, Patrick Dolan, and William H. Eddy, age 28, and his wife Eleanor and their 2 children. The German contingent of Boggs' caravan also went with the Donners and Reeds, which included John Kesseberg, his pregnant wife and their daughter, a young couple by the name of Wolfinger, who traveled with 2 young men named Joseph Reinhardt and Augustus Spitzer, and their driver, quote, Dutch Charlie, unquote, Berger. The older and seemingly more experienced George Donner was elected to lead the group, and thus it became known as the Donner Party. The Donner Party arrived at Fort Bridger around July 27th, hoping to find the author of their trusted guidebook about the trail, the discoverer of the Hastings Cut-Off, but Lansford Hastings wasn't at Fort Bridger. The owners of the fort, Jim Bridger and Luis Vasquez, informed the Donner Party he had gone ahead with another group. Bridger and Vasquez also neglected to mention a note of warning sent back to the fort by another emigrant caravan, advising against the cut-off as it was untested and completely unusable by wagons. Hastings was paying Bridger and Vasquez to send people on his route, so they kept the note a secret. This was only the beginning of the troubles of the Donner Party, but before I get into the rest of their story, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 45,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 140 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, have access to all the horror story readings, and get updates on past episodes. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly quiz episode where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the resources I've used while researching an episode. And for $20, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, we have reviewed horror video games and television shows, discussed the plague pits of London, and tried out historic recipes from previous episodes. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. Oh, I'm a poor, wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world below. There is no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go. Whilst staying for 3 days of rest at Fort Bridger, the Donner Party decided they would go after Hastings and try to catch up. Before leaving, they had their horses shod, bought new oxen and provisions, and hired a new driver, Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, who was 16. Trudeau was from New Mexico and claimed to have knowledge of the indigenous peoples and terrain along the way to California. The company was also joined by another family, the McCutcheons, which included 30-year-old William, his 24-year-old wife Amanda, and their 2-year-old daughter Harriet. On July 31st, the Donner Party set off after Hastings. The going was slow, going only 27 miles in 2 days. Then the trouble started. Edward Breen broke his ankle after falling from a horse, and when the group approached Weber Canyon, which Hastings had said would be the best way forward, they found a note from Hastings saying the canyon was impassable and to try going over the mountains instead. The note also suggested sending a messenger on horseback ahead to catch up with Hastings so he could guide them better. Their confidence shaken, James Reed, Stanton, and William Pike rode ahead as the note suggested. On August 8th, they finally caught up to Hastings, who agreed to go back with them to help guide, but then, halfway back, decided he should stay with the group he was already leading. As Stanton and Pike had stayed behind to rest, Hastings showed Reed a potential route on his map, then left him. As he rode back, Reed marked what he felt would be a good route with a hatchet. After returning to the Donner Party on August 10th, the group decided to try Reed's route. It was 5 miles on horseback, but unfortunately, the party was traveling in wagons. This meant clearing the path for the wagons as they went, cutting down trees and brush. It took 2 weeks to go 5 miles. While they were blazing this trail, another caravan joined them, also trusting Hastings to get them to California before the snows came. The Graves Caravan was led by 57-year-old Franklin Ward Graves, his wife Elizabeth at 47, and their children, Mary, who was 20, William, who was 18, Eleanor, 15, Lavinia, 13, Nancy, 9, Jonathan, 7, Franklin Jr., who was 5, and Elizabeth, who was nearly 1, as well as their married daughter Sarah and her husband, Jay Fosdick, and a 25-year-old teamster named John Snyder, all traveling together in 3 wagons. An older man named Hardcoop also rode with them, as well as Luke Holleran, a young man with tuberculosis who seemed to get sicker every day. The arrival of the Graves group brought the Donner Party to 87 members in around 70 wagons. Stanton and Pike were found as the party inched forward. The two had become lost on their way back from Hastings camp and were nearly starving. After days of felling trees, the party found their way blocked by a box canyon. Moving around it until they found a way out, the party slowly made their way to Emigration Canyon, the last obstacle before the Salt Lake Valley. It was a steep and tight passage, and 6 to 8 oxen were needed to pull each wagon up the slope that now bears the name Donner Hill. By August 27th, they finally crossed over the Wasatch Mountain Range and were camped in the Utah Valley. The party was exhausted and more than a little demoralized. Their hero, Hastings, had been proven a liar, or at least severely misinformed. The group switched to using a reliable map rather than Hastings' book. Still, once they found the trail of the group Hastings was leading, they followed it. On August 25th, Luke Holleran died. It's unknown where he was buried, but usually wagon caravans buried their dead right on the trail, out of fear the indigenous peoples would tamper with the grave. Soon after, Keseberg's wife gave birth to a son. Keseberg, who had been witnessed abusing his wife, was not popular, so no real celebration occurred. The party crossed what Hastings called the Spring Valley, but would later be known as the Skull Valley due to the vast number of bones from ancient bison and indigenous peoples that scattered the area. On August 28th, they found Hope Springs, the last freshwater spring before the Great Salt Lake Desert crossing. Near the spring, they found a tattered note. Tamsin Donner gathered the pieces and put them together as best she could. It read, quote, 2 days, 2 nights, hard driving, cross desert, reach water, unquote. The note suggested that Hastings had proven himself wrong again. The desert crossing would take longer than he had thought. The party gathered as much grass as they could for their animals and filled every empty receptacle with water. They had no choice but to go on. While Hastings had originally said the desert would take a day and a night to cross, it was actually 83 miles to cross the vast desert, more than double the distance he had estimated. The party moved slowly day and night, only stopping to feed and water themselves and their animals. The daytime temperatures were baking, while the night was near freezing. The people walked alongside the wagons to lighten the load for the oxen. Near the middle of the desert, the salt became mushy and sticky like mud, slowing the wagons and causing delays when the wheels had to be dug out. The Eddy and Graves families had healthier oxen and therefore surged ahead of the rest of the party toward Pilot Peak, the landmark that showed the end of the desert. The 9 wagons of the Donners and Reeds quickly fell behind. Everyone was thirsty and the water was running out. Cattle and oxen began dropping as they walked, never to get up again. Desperate, James Reed and several of the teamsters unhooked the oxen and cattle from the wagons and rode ahead on horseback to search for water, leaving the families with the wagons. When the animals sensed water, they stampeded forward, and several were lost in the wilderness after reaching Pilot Peak. Reed filled what containers he could with water and headed back to the wagons. The teamsters said they would return as soon as the animals had been watered. Reed made it back to the wagons and shared the water with his family and the Donners, but there wasn't nearly enough. They waited an entire day before leaving the wagons and heading out on foot to Pilot Peak. The teamsters hadn't come back because the animals had scattered. The party spent a week searching for animals and retrieving wagons. Essential items from several wagons were consolidated, and empty wagons and many heavy and unnecessary items were left behind in the desert. 38 cows and oxen were lost, as were 11 more days of travel. On September 10th, the party started again, this time not traveling as closely together as they had. Family stuck with family, as survival had become the #1 priority. That day, a snowstorm hit. It didn't last long, but the Donner Party was spooked. Now they knew they were very late and had little time to cross the Sierra Mountains before they were blocked by the snows. As they progressed, the mothers of the group noticed that they would run out of supplies before reaching California. Therefore, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon rode ahead to get help, aiming for Sutter's Fort on the other side of the Sierras. McCutcheon's wife and infant baby moved into the Donner's wagons. The men followed the route that Hastings had gone, around the Ruby Mountains and then along the Humboldt River, where the Hastings Cut-Off rejoined the proven California Trail. While the men were gone, the wagons continued slowly. Horses and cattle began to disappear during the night, possibly stolen by the Shoshone people in the area, who had learned to deeply mistrust white settlers due to bad dealings in the past. Eventually, the party was able to hunt again when game became available. When they reached the Humboldt River, there was a collective sigh of relief. They had finally rejoined the California Trail after 68 days wasted on the Hastings Cut-Off. However, the river wasn't useful to them except as a guide. The water was turbid, alkali, murky, and provided no game or shade. The banks were also swampy and hid sandy sinks that could mire the oxen and wagons. The party decided to cross it one wagon at a time, using only the healthiest oxen. The Donners went first, with Reed and Eddie following. This split was partially to break up the group for better hunting, and partially because the families were becoming annoyed and mistrustful of one another. They stuck together at night due to the more threatening indigenous activity in the area. Both the Shoshone and the Paiute who lived in the area neither wanted them there nor wanted to help them leave. Many animals went missing in the night. On October 5th, violence broke out amongst the wagons. James Reed and John Snyder got into a fight, and Snyder was killed. Once the wagons were camped for the night, it was decided by the group that James Reed should be banished with nothing but his horse. The next day, after Snyder was buried and Reed was exiled, Virginia Reed and Milt Elliott, one of the Reed teamsters, snuck out and gave Reed some food and his gun, and told him to go find help at Sutter's Fort. He agreed and rode off quickly. Reed soon caught up with the Donner brothers, who were still ahead of the rest of the group. One of their teamsters, Warren Herron, volunteered to go with Reed to go for help. 2 days behind the Donners, the Reed wagon group was in tatters, lost without its leader. As they kept moving, it grew colder and colder. Kesseberg turned Hardcoop out of his wagon. One of the other families saw Hardcoop as they passed, sitting beneath a tree with black, gangrenous feet. No one went to search for him that evening, and he never caught up with the caravan. Eventually, the Reed group caught up with the Donners after emptying and abandoning the large Reed family wagon. The Reed family had been taken in by the Graves. The next morning, the camp was attacked by Paiute raiders who killed or stole 18 cattle. The swampy, sandy land took a horse, and another died as it walked. Oxen were lost, stolen, or killed. When the Eddy family had only one ox left, they abandoned their wagon and went on foot. The Wolfingers, who were rumored to be very wealthy, decided to bury their wagon and go on horseback. Joseph Reinhardt and Augustus Spitzer stayed behind to help Mr. Wolfinger with this task. Reinhardt and Spitzer caught up with the rest of the caravan later without Wolfinger, giving vague details about another Paiute raid, but some suspected they had killed him. There was little water, little food, and the days were growing colder. 6 more oxen died. Eventually, the group reached the Truckee River and were relieved to see trees and fresh water. Many people hadn't eaten for 2 days and were very thankful when geese were shot by Eddy. The group split again, this time with the Donners trailing behind as they moved along the Truckee River. They all eventually made it to a broad valley called Truckee Meadows. The high Sierra Mountains were visible from the valley, with snow atop their peaks. The Donner Party were more than a month behind schedule now. They also weren't sure how to proceed. They could buckle down in the meadows for the winter or try to forge ahead. William Pike and William Foster decided to go ahead on their own to search for supplies. While preparing and cleaning their guns, Foster's went off, hitting Pike in the back and killing him. 3 distinct groups had now formed. The Breens, Dolan, Eddies, and Keseberg had the healthiest animals and wanted to forge ahead. The Murphys, Graves, and Reeds were unsure, and the Donners, their teamsters, and the widow Wolfinger were the slowest moving and weren't sure they could make it before the snow. While they still traveled near one another, allegiances were now with family only. The decision of whether to stay or go had to be made soon, because winter was near upon them. There is so much more to this story than I can relay here. If you want an incredibly detailed yet readable account of the Donner-Reed journey, I recommend Michael Wallace's 2017 book, The Best Land Under Heaven. Using journals, letters, and articles written on the journey, it pieces together the first part of this journey in great detail, and then uses the published accounts of the survivors to describe the long winter and just what they had to do to survive. But we'll get into that in part 2. Until then, keep up that spark of curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show @MorbidPodcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram @Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media, and please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Delayla, Stephen, Chris, Mallory, Jamie, Crystal, Sarah, Elizabeth, Allison, T, Murder and More Podcast, Beth, Claire, Aaron, The Midnight Library Podcast, Lou, Hannah, Ash, and Elena. Eric M. has my eternal gratitude for becoming a patron. Thank you, Eric. A huge thank you to everyone who reported the fraudulent podcast that infringed on the rights of the MCP, as well as other creepy podcasts such as Morbid, the True Crime Podcast, the Historical AF Podcast, Podmortem, Bones and Bobbins, and Morbidology. The situation was resolved quickly thanks to you. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.